I work with Reformed University Fellowship as an area coordinator over Alabama, Mississippi, West Tennessee, and Arkansas, what we're generically referring to as the Mid-South. And I've been with RUF now for almost 21 years. I started back in 1994 at the University of Memphis after getting my degree from Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson. Came to the University of Memphis and started the RUF there for about 5 years. In 1999, my wife and I moved to Oxford, Mississippi, just about an hour south in North Mississippi, to work at the RUF at Ole Miss, where we were for 12 years. And in 2011, we took this job as an area coordinator. Having said that, it was sometime in the late 1990s, 96, 97 or so, when we were sitting at an RYM board meeting, and someone said, you know, we really ought to offer something for youth pastors. And so we started a seminar at our summer beach conference for youth pastors. In other words, when the students went out to do their seminars, the youth pastors came to do that. And I got to be a part of that very first thing. So to look out over sort of this ocean of people is really incredibly encouraging to the folks that love RYM. I'm not a part of the board anymore, but it's been my pleasure. This is kind of my only contact with RYM, and so I love being able to come in for 48 hours and be with y'all and meet you. So thank y'all for doing what you do. One of the things that you'll find is true when you get married and have children is that youth ministry takes on a very different relevance to your life when you have children that are involved. I have 3 children. My oldest, Anna Grace, is in 9th grade. She's 15. And my second child, Caroline, she is in 8th grade. She just turned 14 about a week and a half ago. Isn't that nuts? And then my son, Luke, is my youngest, and he is 10 years old and in 4th grade. And so when my oldest daughter started in 7th grade, I took this job as an area coordinator, and my wife and I jumped back into our youth group so we could kind of be there with our kids through it. So I feel like I'm in there with it. We now host our Sunday night fellowship. I do all of our youth pastor training at our church in Oxford. So all that's to say is, like, you guys are important to me for very personal reasons. And youth ministry is personal to me, not just because of my involvement in it, but also because my kids are invested in it. So, man, what you do is a big stinking deal. And I realize that a lot of times in church contexts, like the ones in which you're plugged into, you may nurse that regular pastoral ministry suspicion that the things that I'm doing are not noticed by anybody or significant to no one except for the Lord. And I know He loves me, but, you know, it'd be nice if maybe one other person in this church did. So I realize that. But I want you to know that in this environment, like, we think in RYM that what you're doing is the most important thing you could be doing. The center of the kingdom, doggone it, is happening, you know, right here in the ministry planning that you're working together and putting together. So we offer that to you to tell you how much we care about you and love you and appreciate that you're a part of what we're doing. By now, you've probably begun to ask yourself the question, so is it going to be like this all week long in these sessions? Because there are teachers that are coming and it's almost as if they walk up and say, okay, here is a fire hydrant, you know, and they sort of knock off the outside and say, okay, everybody have a drink, because it's coming at you so fast. That was clearly a very poignant illustration for most of you, because I can see the amazement in your faces. That's quite all right. I really thought the fire hydrant thing worked. It worked for me, but not for anybody else. Anyway, we come, though, to a portion in our discussion that we refer to as our presuppositions. Our time for the remaining, and somebody tell me how much time I've got. When is this seminar over? 4:30? We're taking a break in just a few minutes. We'll do half and half to sort of put this in the perspective. Why are we doing this? If you don't mind, let me do like a paragraph on big picture stuff. Because I feel like it's very easy for it to get confused. The language that RYM has chosen the language that has been agreed upon by the board and by sort of tradition and history and whatever else, will to many of you feel not what it should be. There will be some of you that will look at the lingo in which we've chosen to describe the things that we are trying to lay out for you in ministry, that you'll say, I don't really think that's what that means. But it's what we mean. And so there's a sense in which we want to say, go along with this for long enough to kind of get an idea of where it is we're trying to take you. One of the big goals of trying to make sure that your ministry training is in place is so that you can have a shared vocabulary with each other that's intelligible enough to have a conversation with somebody about it. Now, when I say intelligible enough, that means that it really is okay to get back and say, you know what, I'm kind of a mental organization guy, and you guys have kind of muddled some of these things here and there. Or it really seems as if you're emphasizing this sort of aspect of this vocabulary, and someone else is kind of emphasizing that. There's a sense in which we're not afraid of that. For some of your types of personalities, it will really grate you on the inside, because what you really, really long for is someone to give you a manual of youth ministry. Just explain to me the facts. Good, we got it. RYM is very technical, presuppositions. This is not intended to be for you your new ministry plan. As a matter of fact, I think we would probably make the argument that's kind of the opposite of what we're wanting you to get. But you can't begin a conversation with your peers, which is what RYM is trying to do. You can't even begin a conversation with your peers until you have shared lingo. Don't let the word lingo put you off. Some people are like, oh, lingo, that's exclusionary talk. Like, that keeps people at arm's length. No, well, it can. But in this room, if you don't have shared vocabulary, lingo, verbiage, you can't really build any connections. And so a lot of what we're doing with these headings under principles and presuppositions is intended just to get the conversation started. What you're going to find is as you sit in RYM year in and year out, and of course our pitch is that this is not the kind of thing that you learn. Well, I went through my 2 or 3 year curriculum, now we're done with RYM, let's go see what somebody else has to do. No, this is a process staff training of enforced self-reflection. In other words, we are trying to talk you into at least once a year calling time out on your year and coming together with a group of like-minded people with a shared vocabulary and ask the question, why did I do what I did this year? Did it work? What do I mean by work? Have I thought through what my goals are? Have I known how to set good goals? And having done so, to evaluate yourself and then encourage each other as you press on forward into it. Does that make sense? That's why we're doing this. That's the whole goal. The reason why you have to do this every year, we would make a little pitch in campus ministry that you need to do it more than just once a year. The reason why you have to do it on a regular basis is because you have one of the most gelatinous jobs in all of ministry. That is, it is ever moving. It's a moving target. You cannot get settled into youth ministry because you catch people as they're passing through a phase in life. You stay the same, they come channeling through. But what that means is every single year is different. And so it means that the plans that you employ, deploy, exercise, have got to deal with that ambiguity. They got to deal with those changes. We also recognize that you're going through changes as well. For most of you in the room, you are of the younger persuasion, and because of that, you're still in the midst of changing. You're still growing, and that means you've got to continue to work on finding what your voice is. RYM wants to be in on that conversation by providing us with some common points to talk through and to keep at the forefront of ministry. And so we come to what we refer to as our presuppositions. Okay? I'm hoping that at least someone has talked to you about You know what? I may rewrite that word up there. But for just a second, I'm going to erase this. One of the major things that we talk about here, if you haven't, we'll go ahead and do it now, is this little graphic. Has anyone drawn this for you yet or written this? Okay. They have? This means yes? Okay, good. This is very simple. There's nothing complex about this or magic except for a couple things. There's a couple of pieces of magic in it. Not like the real magic that was going on over lunchtime. Someone was like doing some magic over lunchtime, so that's kind of cool. I'm not making that up. Someone was doing tricks at lunchtime. Who was it? Is somebody here in this room? Sweet! We have a magician in the room. He'll just vanish before your very eyes. There is some stuff that you came to believe was important. And one day you thought, somebody ought to tell somebody about that. Or someone said they would pay you to go tell somebody about it. This is what we mean by theology. We've been talking about the principles as being the power, the motor of your ministry that really helps us state in succinct, tight, youth-appropriate terms what our theology is really about. It's a theology of truth. It's a theology of grace. It's a theology of holiness and change, Scripture, justification, sanctification. It's a theology of expectation, glorification. But there are things that we've gotten excited about that we really believe can be transformative for people. Secondly, then there is the job. You got to get up and do something. Hey, we want you to be our youth director. Okay, good luck. Now what? You got to do something. So you had a lock-in or a barbecue or a swimming party or something. And I'm doing the youth ministry here. There. Am I? Methodology. There's stuff that you do. Something that you are busy with. When RYM says philosophy of ministry, by that we do not mean what you got when you were in college in philosophy. We have no intention of talking about Immanuel Kant and his view of, I don't even remember anything about Immanuel Kant. Anything. What was the big book someone say his big book. You know who you are. What? Yeah, the Critique of Pure Reason? That's it. It's all Immanuel Kant favorite. That is not what we mean by this word. If you think that we mean the esoterica of metaphysics, you're in the wrong place. Because that's not what we mean by a philosophy of ministry. What we mean is the identification, this is my sentence, of ministry dynamics that keep you from acting in such a way that contradicts what you believe. Let me say that again. By philosophy of ministry, we mean a collection of ministry dynamics, forces, patterns, change agents, wisdom issues, avenues of ministry. The list goes on and on. Ministry dynamics that you're gaining expertise with them keeps you from acting in such a way and doing things that inadvertently contradict the things that you say you believe. Spent the last couple of days talking to people about the topic of evangelism and how much the idea of evangelism, if you stick with us for next year, you can come back and hear all this, how much the idea of evangelism is wrapped up with the idea of methodologies. If I'm going to evangelize someone, I got to be doing something to that end. And of course, people of the Reformed and Presbyterian persuasion can often be caricatured, sometimes we deserve it, sometimes we don't, as being those who could not care less about evangelism. We are the frozen chosen, because you believe in that procrastination doctrine, right? That's an old Wilson Benton joke, and it wasn't all that funny when he said it either, so I apologize for that. But there is a way to behave in such a way in evangelism that actually could contradict the things that you say that you believe. There was an essay that was written by a guy named J.I. Packer, and I made sure that Ken brought some of the copies of these books, so I would warmly recommend it to you. J.I. Packer's book, The Quest for Godliness, subtitled The Puritan Vision of the Christian Life, is my recommendation for the most succinct, theologically expressed version of RYM's vision for youth ministry that there is, at least that I've read. This is as close as it gets. It's a little bit academic, but not bad. It's J.I. Packer. But it contains sort of within it a number of insights where Packer looks and critiques where we are in American evangelicalism, of which you are a great part. And in it, he talks about the modern evangelistic method system that lives with assumptions about people being able to come to Christ anytime they want. And he simply entertains in this introductory essay that he wrote this question, what if we don't believe that that is theologically true? Would that not then say something about the way in which I went to actually evangelize people? And here's his little sentence that, in my opinion, sums up RYM's philosophy of ministry as well as it possibly can. Modes of action, methodology, which imply another doctrine must be rejected. That's the sentence. Modes of action which imply another doctrine must be rejected. That's in the chapter on Puritan evangelism, for those of you that want to go look it up. So what we're saying is can we get together for a week once a year and walk through the collective wisdom of the years that exists in this room and gather around a shared vocabulary to ask myself if the modes of action that I sort of took on in my ministry this last year are somehow implying to my people something different than what I come to believe is true. All right. So what I'm saying is, in some ways, as Reformed Presbyterians, the Westminster Confession of Faith is our essential statement of doctrine, specifically speaking. Narrowly speaking, we can talk about the principles as those real action things, the redemptive things of ministry. When we talk about our methodology broadly, we use a word called flexible. Our methods are flexible. By the way, one small little thing, I'm sure someone has said this to you. Just because we say flexible does not mean, therefore, we have no plan at all. There are those who have come in and out of RYM training and been like, well, I learned at RYM that if you got a plan, that's being rigid with your methodology, and we don't do that. And you've gone back to your sessions, and all a ruling elder thinks when he hears you say that is, you don't want to work. No. Yeah, you had better put together a ministry plan. What we're simply saying, though, is that ministry plan needs to be something that is tailored to your situation. And what we're hoping is that RYM Youth Pastor Training helps to grow you in the wisdom that it takes to make that decision well. Broadly speaking, we say our methodology is flexible. Narrowly speaking, by our methodology, we mean our presuppositions. This helps me define what we mean by our presuppositions, this little breakdown. What is a presupposition in RYM's philosophy of ministry? Well, there is some sense in which if you know what the word itself means, it'll help you around. We know a presupposition is an idea that I am assuming. It's an under-the-radar kind of assumption. But the way in which a presupposition works is actually fundamental to helping you in ministry in this way. An assumption in ministry creates a ministry posture for you. I'm going to use the word posture. I'll use the word a stance. You might even say that a presupposition is a mode of ministry, M-O-D-E. That is, there is a manner in which you can come to approach ministry that if you're not aware of the way in which it works in your ministry, you can actually abuse people instead of helping them. This is one of the great revelations, I think, from ministry people that doesn't get talked about anywhere near enough as it should. And that is that the church, in many ways, can uniquely be a place of great destruction and abuse for people, rather than being what it ought to be, and that is the very impetus for the kingdom of God's advancement in the world. The church can be a place of gross destruction, but it can also be very subtle destruction. Ministry people are rarely aware of how often the things that they do can be turned into abusive situations. I'll mention a couple of examples that are one's a bit over the top, the second one's a little more practical. I wonder how many of you are familiar with the work of Tullian, am I saying this right? Is it Chividian? Chividian. Who pronounced, by a vowel somewhere in there. Go with Smith or something. He has a brother who's done some work in the area of child abuse, and his first name is Boz. And the work that he has done is in the area of the way in which child abusers function in the midst of the church. He's put together a ton of resources. Is he a lawyer by trade, I think? Is that his vocation? But his premise basically was this, and there was a lot of hot water that came out last summer with some of the things going on with the Covenant Life group that I won't get into, but I ended up reading a lot of this guy's material about how to protect your church from predators. And one of the things he says he opens all of his seminars with when he goes to talk to churches is he said, you need to know that for predators, when they are thinking about finding victims and they are plotting and scheming and planning, that a church is almost a perfect culture for a predator to find a home in. Why? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, the church can oftentimes be a place of implicit authority. We would say that there's an explicit authority. There's an authority that God's Word exercises. And we know that God has granted some of that authority to His elders to oversee. But how easy that posture of grace and service can turn into a place of authoritarianism in an unbridled and unhealthy and destructive way. So that when a predator comes into that, he knows that if he finds his way into something, that he can use the language of authority to keep you from questioning his actions or her actions. It's an overwhelming majority of men. But it's an authoritarian atmosphere where they find a perfect place because people will not question them there. He goes on with a long list of other things that makes the church in many ways a target, a safe haven for predators. And he says that unless you're doing something very specific to work against that tide, then they will find a home in your church. Every single church ought to have some kind of measures in place, whether it's the simplest of background checks on the people that you employ in the nursery, all the way to full-blown methods where you've got committees that are in charge of overseeing this. We have to assume a posture of protection of people. Boz is saying. He's not my best friend because I can't pronounce his last name. Second sort of recommendation. You need to read Peter, and I can't pronounce this guy's name, Scazio. What is the Emotionally Healthy Church? Scazzero. This guy pastored a church up in New York, I think Brooklyn, for quite some time, for many years. And he wrote a book called The Emotionally Healthy Church. Nowhere near as over the top as some of the predatorial child abuse world. What this guy ends up going into is the way in which just the church environment can foster a place of hiding and keeping away from having my sin and sin patterns exposed, rather than it being a place of health and healing. And one of the things that he mentions in this book, and I'll never forget this, is he said, you need to come to the moment where you realize that for many people, their joining of your church is a way of saying to the world, you don't have to ask me the hard questions about my soul. Because the assumption is that the people that go to church are the good people. And so therefore, by their very existence, they have joined your church so that they won't have to deal with the questions that would come about their behavior, or about their excesses in life, or about those little flashes that you saw that look more than just like a quick temper, or perhaps the fourth time you saw them drink too much at that public event. Or perhaps the vision that you see coming of them through their child's eyes, where the kid is saying something strange about what their parents are doing. They very well may have joined your church so that they don't have to ask those questions. Now, how we change the church to be something better is not the purpose of my discussion. All I'm wanting you to embrace is this idea that it is well within the realm of possibility. In some ways, we are even set up to create potentially abusive situations merely because the fact that we never questioned the posture that we're taking towards the people we're called to minister to. That may sound a little over the top and a little defensive, but that's kind of partly of it. There is a sense in which our presuppositions are things that we are trying to make explicit to us so that as we percolate over them, as we consider what they do, that they give for us a sense of posture. They become a mode in which I take on so that in the end I wind up not abusing people, but rather being the blessing that I want the gospel to be to them. And I would just encourage you to not think the thought to yourself, I would never do that. I would never do something to hurt someone. Don't think that thought. Rather be circumspect. Look around you and think, whoa, is there anything that I might be doing that might actually be more hurtful than it is helpful? Yes, at least own that enough. Last question, and we'll go into actually get to the presuppositions themselves with which I will deal, which are just the first 5, and then Joey's going to cover 6 and 7. And I lost what I was getting ready to say. We're talking about presuppositions and, where it fits in the philosophy of ministry. It'll come back to me. Let's dive into them, shall we say? And see what these things are. These are statements about posture that create a mode of ministry as we do things. The first one that we mention is a biblical/theological assumption. I will put in parenthesis out here that our theology is unashamedly reformed. That is our first of our presuppositions, is a biblical theological assumption about people. That is to say this: in RYM, we are recommending to you, or at least we're laying our cards on the table, that we are not coming to the text of Scripture in an assumption of theological neutrality. We're not there by ourselves. When the religious context in which I grew up was non-denominational and sort of old-time kind of Bible church sort of mentality. And from very earliest of ages, it was stressed to me that, I realize that there are Baptists out there. I realize that there are Methodists out there, and Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Catholics. But at this church, we're going to be biblical. Did you feel that? You ever heard anybody say something to that effect? In other words, and of course no one ever put it this way, we finally, at last, are the first generation in 2,000 years of Jesus' church to actually approach the text of Scripture with pure objectivity. And the form that our church has taken for the world is finally the purest version of God's church. Now see, they wouldn't put it that way. But that underlies the posture, does it not? And some of you are saying, I'm non-denominational. What's wrong with you? That's not my target at this point. But it is possible that you can hold your non-denominationalism in such a way that says something false to the people you're ministering to. Does that follow? That they can step back and think, well, yeah, boy, all those weirdos over there that are Baptist and Presbyterian, and finally we got the Bible here. Can you not see that that would foster an extraordinary arrogance? An extraordinary naivety about the history of the development of doctrine over the last 2,000 years? Slouching even towards a denial of how the Holy Spirit has been at work for all this time to help us clarify some of these things? Yes, that's abusive to people. And so in RYM, we're coming along and saying we do not take up a posture with our people living under the myth of neutrality. That is, we are here to actually take a side. Yes, I have opinions about baptism. Some of those opinions I'd be glad to share with you if you ever get interested. It may be, however, though, because we're in a youth relationship, that I may not necessarily want to fight about those. There are a few things that I really would like to fight about because I think they're super big important, but I'm willing to let the whole baptism thing sort of flex. It's not the major deal, but I don't want to pretend to you that I'm giving you, oh student, some sort of mere Christianity that's not coming from a certain perspective. We are honest about our commitments in RYM. We own very freely that, yes, we are Presbyterian. Yes, we are Baptist. We own these expressions as these things. Now, my guess is there's at least one of you out there who are saying to yourself, I did not expect RYM to be quite as naive as all this. I mean, hasn't Les and the rest of the board of directors heard that like this generation, they're not down with that. If I read one more article about this in the Huffington Post, I'm going to take hostages, okay? The next generation is anti-institutional. Don't start coming and talking church institution to this young people growing up because they don't want to hear it. They are independent. They are fiercely individualistic. And the second that they get the whiff that you've got some kind of system behind what you're doing, you're done. You lack authenticity. You don't have that genuineness that these young people want. Okay, A, hogwash. B, there's a better way, and I think I can prove it. Number one, hogwash. Why is that hogwash? It's hogwash because of what happened to you when you were in high school. Did you ever know, or maybe you were this person, the guy who sort of showed up and you have a conversation with him, maybe it's a girl, guy, whatever, and you're like, man, it looks like you've had some wardrobe changes. Seems like every day this week you've worn that big black coat that goes all the way to the floor. You got those new black boots that are pretty awesome. And boy, the little eyeliner underneath the thing, that's a pretty thick eyeliner line right there. And your fingernails are all black and stuff. And I don't know, you're flying around on a broom or something. That's even better. It seems as if you've changed a little bit. And you get a response that ends up sounding something to the effect of this. Yeah, honestly, I'm just tired of being like everybody else. Tired of following the crowd, Just want to do something that was individual, something that was more really me. And to the inside of you kind of think to yourself, So you decided to look like every single other goth person who ever took that up as their thing. In other words, the more that you try to be like, I'm not going to be like everybody else. I'm going to go join this group of people. Who, guess what? They got something that unites them together. You are not non-denominational. You are not liturgical. In my church, we don't like liturgy. That's for the weirdo kind of ceremonial people. Okay, hang on. You got something that you do every week, right? Well, yes. Then guess what? You have a liturgy. Now, it may be a good one, it may be a bad one, but you got a liturgy. How about this one? You know, the truth of the matter is, Les, I've just gotten tired of fighting, and when it all comes down to it, I just think that the Bible is about Jesus, and our ministry ought to be about Jesus. I agree. 2 enthusiastic thumbs up for Jesus being the central point of your theology. But I have a very simple question for you. Which Jesus? Because there's a lot of Jesuses out there. And the second that you even begin to entertain an answer to that question, which, by the way, they always do, you are in the realm of theology. Again, it may be a bad theology, maybe a good theology. But to be theological is not on the list of options if you have thoughts about God. Are you following this? So this generation is not anti-institutional. Because go figure, they're still, drum roll please, joining institutions. They're joining institutions. They're clumping. They are communal. You want to know why? Because they're human beings. And they look for lines of continuity. They're looking for places where they feel at home. That's the reason, number one, why it's absolute hogwash. The second thing is, I think I can prove it. The history of Reformed University ministries and the history of Reformed youth ministries, I think can demonstrate very clearly that we have not suffered from being honest about our theological commitments. Sometime in the 70s and 80s, there was, people began to take notice that if there is a worldview assumption among Western young people, and this is true for the last 30 years or so, it's been this one central idea that truth is relative. There is no meta-narrative. There is nothing that draws everything together. All of these sort of convictions are absolutely and utterly relative. You can't say that one thing is the right thing, except for the truth that you can't say that one thing is the right thing. The absolute statements tend to kind of creep in there, don't they? A little bit hard to escape that sort of stuff. But I think that you are living with one of the first generations that's getting a bit of the bulletins from Western culture that the hangover has started. Because if you go into a cultural context with a group of people who have decided that they will jettison the idea of truth, it is not that you will have a group of people that will believe nothing. That's not the fear. I think that probably was the fear in the 80s and the 90s. It's like, what will come of this world? Truth is relative. They will walk away. There'll be nothing. We'll be this group of crazy agnostics. And the sin will be off the charts. You maybe can make a case for some of that. I think rather the greater fear is not that people would believe nothing. The fear is that people would believe anything. And in my opinion, it's the loudest voice at any time. And worldwide right now, the loudest voice is the voice of Islam. Allah is speaking. Am I the only one who gets creeped out, like I was last night, entertaining this cold, flipping through the, what's my flip thing? Flip board. Flip board? Flip board. And an article about how they had found an ISIS recruitment center in Japan this weekend. Am I the only one that read this? Japan. Okay? Is this a culturally crazy sort of group? And here's what we do. We think about ISIS and we see all the stuff going on in Syria. We think about, the sort of a spread of Islam through Europe. And in our minds, we tend to think, well, yeah, there's crazy people everywhere, Les. Yeah, lots of nutty people will go and take up arms and go shoot people. But it's growing. It's moving. Why? Because in the absence of real conviction, it's not that people will believe nothing, it's that they'll believe anything. And the anything can oftentimes be the loudest voice. And right now, there's a system of doctrine, a system of life, a rigid vision of life that is suddenly looking compelling to your youth group. Anna Grace came home. So we switched over from our little Christian school into, the government school. At public high school in Oxford. And it was very interesting. She talked about coming home? And she said, yeah. She goes, that's so-and-so. She is one of the ones who will oftentimes come to school in this like thing that wraps around her head. And I said, a burqa? And she said, yeah, a burqa. And I was like, there we go. Oxford, Mississippi. Not the like booming metropolis of, cultural advancement by anyone's guess. Suddenly my daughter is face to face with someone who's wearing a burqa to school at Oxford High School. I find that interesting. And I'm not trying to do sort of the scaremongering like, they're coming. But I'm saying that there is a force in the world that is gaining acceptance among Western culture because we've been walking around the whole time in the church being like, well, let's be careful not to tell them what we're really about because they'll run them away. We don't want to tell them it's about the church, for goodness sake. Shh, this is not church. Oh, look over here, distraction. And we've been playing this bait and switch thing in the youth group for 40 years. Our premise in RYM is that we would like to dig inside of you, a biblical theological assumption that no, we're actually coming with a perspective that is distinctly Reformed, Presbyterian, and honest about it. Not all of it do we hold with the same conviction as others. I mean, honestly, I'm not going to fight with you about the mode of baptism. Some of you will, and I would look at you and say, knock yourself out, but I probably won't have that conversation. I'll fight about these. These are big ones. All right? Okay, so that's our first one. I'm going to stop right there and pause to check my time and ask if there are any questions of clarification. Wow. Oh, good. Any questions while we're here? Yes, in the back.
Do you have any good interactions when elders are pushing for you to teach on things like mode of baptism,
like that? What is that music? I don't. That is. Thank you. I'm going to say that for a specific sort of thing. The reason is my gut instinct is to say if someone actually was that out of touch with what it meant to do youth ministry, I'd have a deeper problem than just the fact that they brought it up. And I'm not pointing at them. It may be my issue. I may not have pitched it in a way. The way I always said it was this: I have an opinion about a lot of things. But it's naive to think that all of those opinions are held with the same degree of certainty that others are. Again, I put mode of baptism out here. The Trinity, that one's way out here. Probably not budging on the Trinity. Whew. Good luck. The question is where things sort of fall on that realm of certainty. I'm not going to lie to you. Is this being recorded? Never mind. You can ask me during the break. That was a good question that I completely dodged and avoided, so anyone else want to try?
I would say you still want it to be the emphasis of your ministry. I mean, if you have the elders saying, teach your kids on the mode of baptism, knock yourself out. I mean, they talk about the beauty of the covenant, and baptism is a sign of the covenant. By the way, this is the mode we embrace. We want. I don't think you have to make it an emphasis of ministry, and at the same time, you don't have to get up in your elder's face over it. Your elders are coming to you and saying, don't teach the doctrine of justification to our kids.
Then you got to leave. I'll say this. Did you notice what Joey just did, though? In his response to that question, he said, okay, we'll teach on it. Start with the covenant. What Joey did was he immediately took this issue and then he went, and he moved back and said, where do I put that in my big picture? And he said covenant, which is part of his doctrine of Scripture. So you can get from our principles to the issues which we hold, it's the acknowledgement of the fact that it is back of that. Got a great amount of certainty about the covenant, of course. That was a good exercise, much better. Joey will be answering all the questions in our seminar today. Okay? All right, can we take a 5-minute break, like a real 5-minute break? I'm going to start talking at 3:32 or something like that. Y'all take a break. I got a text. All right. Good. Y'all have great questions. Thanks for that. And I'll try to continue to move through this in our last session before we finish at 4:30. Is that correct? Yes. Good, good. Second assumption that we're bringing to the table is a providential assumption. Remember, our presuppositions are those things which create a posture whereby we can be. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it, Alan, since you brought it up. Our presuppositions, this is another way to say it, is a posture that gives us the ability to be flexible in our methods. Again, what I said to you at the beginning was, when I say that we are flexible in our methodology, that doesn't mean that we don't put together ministry plans. But as we execute some kind of ministry plan, we are going to do so in a certain stance. I keep using the word posture, a mode. And that's what these are. They're coloring for us a way of approaching people, but they themselves are not necessarily what we explicitly set in front of people as what we're about. For instance, Reformed theology as an assumption. There is no question that if you ask me a question, if you prick my skin, I will bleed the 5 points of Calvinism. I have so owned that doctrinal system. But I do not assume that when I'm speaking to someone, that just because they have acquiesced and been like, okay, the Bible teaches predestination. I got it. I can't walk away and be like, ha-ha, ministry success. That's not necessarily a success. Why? Because our principles are setting those things forward. But I would also say that Reformed theology is a presupposition and not a principle. Reformed theology is. Reformed theology is our underwear. It's not our outer coat necessarily. We're not here to make Reformed enclaves. That's not the goal. We are here to be honest about the fact that we are Reformed. So you see how having a presupposition is what gives me the ability to be flexible. This was the most apparent to me in campus ministry, which will be a little bit different for you. But it was the most apparent to me when I was dealing with Roman Catholic students. It was fairly regular that when someone would come to Reformed University Fellowship, they would want to come and be like, I grew up Catholic. Can I still come to RUF? That was always the question. I'd be like, no! Out! Sure, if you want to be a... No, never mind. I'm going to go there. It was a part of the confession, but I'm not going to do it. But where do you start with a Roman Catholic? Have you ever thought about this? You sit down with someone who's born, raised, reared, kind of had whatever cultural involvement they had as a Catholic. They've been coming to your meetings. They kind of hear you. Sounds all right, I guess. And they come to you and they're kind of like, well, I just want to know the difference between like your deal and like being a Roman Catholic. Like, where do you start? Where every student I ever talked to started, they were always like, because look, here's the deal. Like, I don't pray to Mary. They're all defensive about praying to Mary, which is really interesting. Because I think that's like the first most embarrassing evangelical thing that you can like bring up. It's kind of like predestination for Calvinists. They go, oh, you're a Calvinist? So you believe in predestination. And you want to be like, yes, it's the only thing I believe. And the only thing that I know to talk about. Roman Catholics have got to feel that exact same way when someone goes, oh, you're Catholic. Do you pray to Mary? They've got to feel that way. I just bet that. So they look and be like, look, I don't pray to Mary. They're all defensive about it. Where do you start? The way in which the presuppositions guided me in that conversation was that it helped me to say, look, to be honest with you, there's probably lots of differences. I want to be perfectly clear that back in the day, there were people that were protesting about excesses within the Roman Catholic Church that they had problems with. And they protested so much that they became protesters. And eventually people called them Protestants or Protestants. And so that's what I am. I'm one of those folks. There's nothing better than sitting down with someone and saying, hey, let's go ahead and be honest that like 400 some odd years ago, there was a big disagreement. So I assume that your question is more about how did we get to where we are? And inevitably someone will look and be like, oh yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Because I don't want to talk about whether or not they pray to Mary. Do I have an opinion about that? You better believe it. But those questions will dissolve if we can get to the bigger issues. So then you say, well, where do you begin? Da, 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 da. Right here. I would say, you know what I'd love to talk about? I'd love to talk about issues of truth. Where is truth? That's a big question with the Roman Catholic. I want to talk about questions of guilt. How do I absolve my guilt? It's a big question for Roman Catholic too. Number 3, how do I change? Sanctification. What does the process of growth look like? In other words, I began with those. It was a place for me to start. But it was because I had a presupposition of not lying to people about my theological commitments that got us to that point in the conversation. I actually went further with those conversations in that. That's the way in which we deal with presuppositions. Again, I'm almost more interested in you knowing what we mean by a presupposition than that you have all this data that I'm about to throw at you about them. Because I've only got 4 left. Okay? Let's go to the next one. Providential assumptions. The second of the presuppositions we typically hear, and I love the fact that this has become sort of lingo-esque in RYM. We say God is at work. It is a presupposition in RYM that God is at work. We make an assumption that God is at work establishing and accomplishing His purposes for the world, and it cannot be thwarted by anything or anyone. God's providence is His most holy, wise, and powerful, preserving and governing every creature and all their actions. Isn't that what the Shorter Catechism says just about God's providence? That there is someone at the wheel of the universe. I got to watch the Golden Globe winner for Best Drama, Boyhood. It's a little raw in places here and there, so don't show it on the bus coming back from wherever. It's not one of those movies. I found it to be very interesting. This is just last week, so this is the first time this is made as an illustration. First time out. Has anybody seen Boyhood, by the way? So I can at least have, okay, some of you have seen it, good. It's the fascinating story about the kid that they took when he was like 7 years old, and they filmed like a week of the story over 12 years of his life. And they took him from like being 7 to going to his freshman year in college. And it's winning all these crazy awards, like out the wazoo. I mean, the Oscars will be all over Boyhood. And a lot of it is very difficult to watch, especially if you went through difficult circumstances surrounding divorce, alcoholism. It's got a lot of these themes that come through that follow it. It's a powerful movie. I'm not sure that I get it yet, but that's a whole different discussion that Gavin, Breeden, and I will have later on. But here's the question. The central character in Boyhood is constantly projecting a worldview. Like it's almost like the only thing I'd critique the movie is it's a little bit of a glorified version of your classic artsy slacker. I love you if you're artsy. He doesn't like artsy. I'm all about artsy people. But there is a form of an artsy person that trends toward just being like, and wants to sort of baptize in the language of the artist. I think that's false. Who was the artist who said that 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration? Art itself is even something that has to be worked at. And so it's trying to sort of set a view of this guy that's sort of in a different way. But this is what, in the very last speech of the movie, you get kind of the theme of the movie. And his whole point is that nothing in his life really can sum it all up. It's just the moments. That's all life is it's just a series of moments. And in many ways, it's trying to wrap up for you this rather creepy experience of watching this kid grow up over 2.5 hours on the screen. In that sense, it really is an amazing piece of cinema. But he looks and goes, it's just moments. That's all it is. In other words, somewhere along the experiences of pain, of divorce, of falling in love, of being betrayed by friends, of initial experiences with sin, there was an inertia that pulled him, and by virtue of him, the generation of people that you are dealing with, to say there is no one at the wheel of the universe. You feel that? This culture is pulling people to say it's all so random. There is no sense of this. So much of the underlying assumptions of pop culture are sort of intertwined by this idea that it's just happening. In the end, there's no reason for it. Life always turns out the way it was supposed to turn out. Why? Because it turned out that way. Somehow, that is caught by a young person in this culture without trying. It's the inertia, it's pulling it away. And oftentimes, we can do harm in ministry by giving a sense to people that they really are the only ones that are at the wheel of their own universe. The boyhood illustration is sort of the secular version of that, but there's a religious version of this as well. When I was at the University of Memphis 15 some odd years ago, I had a conversation that was very dramatic with a young lady who was somewhat peripherally involved in our ministry. What had happened was is she had gone to a class and done what happens to a lot of people in secular environments, happens to high school people all the time, is they decide that now's the time to take a stand for Christ. The professor maybe is going on a roll, they're taking some sort of pot shots at ministry and Christianity, and this young lady decided that this is my time. I'm drawing a line here, I'm sick of the abuse, I'm going to say something. And so she ended up saying, well, as a Christian, I blah, 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 and fill in the blank. Well, there was an individual in the room who apparently took issue with this and decided to take it upon himself to just be verbally abusive to her. Began to make fun of her, began to mock her, laughed out loud at her, got no support from the professor. The professor allowed it to go on. The back and forth was so tangible that even after the class ended, they took it out in the hall while this guy is still letting her have it. And she's doing her best to sort of hold forth and do the deal. But eventually the guy ends up kind of throwing his hands up, saying some sarcastic, foul words to her, and he marches away. Okay? Well, she then migrates in tears, completely lost her composure, as anyone would, back to the cafeteria. Now, the cafeteria at the University of Memphis was my ministry HQ. Nothing better than this cafeteria because it's right in the middle of campus. It's always great to find locations where you know your high schoolers and junior hires will be. Be there and watch what goes down. So this young lady walks in and she is absolutely in a puddle. She got a friend with her and whatnot, and I was like, oh, Kimberly, come sit down, have a seat. Are you okay? And she described for me the story that I just told you what happened. And as she's trying to get herself together, and she's like, she goes, I'm not worried about, what I said necessarily. Because I was like, look, is there a question? Are you wrestling with whether or not, did he rattle you? She goes, no. She goes, I'm not rattled about me. She goes, what I'm nervous about is what if this guy walks away and never hears the gospel again, and he's going to go to hell because of me? I suddenly thought, well, that's actually worth crying about if that's true. I might burst into tears with you if that's true. Now look, I realize that there's a version of accepting God's providential care over every single square footage of life can lead someone to inactivity when it comes to ministry. Well, God's going to do it, And so I just sit back and do nothing and watch Him go to it. I'm acknowledging that that's there. But I can guarantee you that there is a way of really hurting people by projecting to them that let's take for instance, their relationship to God is primarily up to them. There's a way of doing it in such a way that makes them think that ministry will only happen to their family if they get it right. There's a way of saying that this youth ministry will not grow unless they are able to sort of embrace their responsibilities. You can abuse people by implicitly suggesting to them that this is on their shoulders. Yes, we want to be about these high schoolers eventually taking responsibility. Please, would to God that you would take responsibility for your life, kid. But in so doing, we have a presupposition that guides me from turning that into something where we abuse people. And I have people that I am exhausting for the process. Okay? God is at work. Questions or thoughts about this? Yes. Will? Will?
Yes.
Gotcha.
You said that this is on their shoulders. What is this?
The ministry. The goals that you've set for them. The discipleship of their own lives. Their own salvation. That in the end, that you really are alone. You see how we can easily feed in, even with our spirituality, by giving a version of Christian spirituality that is utterly isolationist and individualistic. Whereas when we implant in our mind the idea of God's providence, this comes in Packer's book, but I can't remember where it is. Packer says that the Puritans, and he's quoting somebody else, were a group of people that were incapable of being disillusioned. Think about that. They were incapable of being disillusioned because they had such a strong view of the absolute sovereignty of God over every event in life. Again, it doesn't need to be an excuse that sort of creates lethargy in people, but it also doesn't need to be the kind of thing that, in the opposite, ends up abusing them because they think it's on their shoulders. The ministry, their salvation, their sanctification, the solution of their family. There are ways in which I can give advice. Sorry, ideas are popping out as I'm talking here, Will. This is more than an answer than you wanted. Like, there are ways in which I can answer students' questions. I'm having a moment. Bear with me. I can answer a student's question in such a way that would make them think something false about the issues they're going through with their family by giving them answers to it. One of the things that was fairly regular for me were people confronting me for my, and there's a long list of things people confronted me about, and it was all appropriate. Most of it. Not all of it. The vast majority was appropriate when they identified what is a didactic impulse inside of me. And that is to be like, oh, hey, they said something in which I have an opinion about. Let me wait for them to quit talking so I can give my speech on the thing they just talked about. Some of you, that sounds familiar. You know what I'm talking about. And so in my very answer, it may be that what I'm saying is absolutely true, but the way in which I've answered, I'm not loving them in my answer. I'm actually giving them an answer so I don't have to love them. I don't have to sit with them. I don't have to weep with them. I don't have to simply... You ever notice how many times in the prophets, this is in Jeremiah somewhere, I heard Joe Novenson do a sermon on this, about the need to be appalled. Well, someone's going to help me with whatever reference this is, where God, the king of Israel, decides in the face of this terrible evil, who's the one who rediscovered the law? Is that Josiah? And comes back and reads the law, and everybody repents, but they spend a day being appalled. I wonder if it's not time just to sit down with someone and just be appalled with them at just how much sin can ravage somebody's family and heart and soul. And yet here I come as the Bible answer man to come and drop something on them. There is a way in which I can actually be abusive to them because I've not been aware. But now here's the deal. Before I lift a bunch of guilt on my own soul, I also don't want to say that God is not at work even in my fumbling as a minister. In other words, this is not just about your students hearing that there is a God who's in control over everything. Guys and girls, this is about you knowing that this is not in your hands. This is God's ministry. He is the one who is at work in, through, about, around your ministry. God is at work. I can trust in that. Somebody else had a hand up. Yes?
Could you give me an example of how that would look? Like an appropriate approach to a problem as an example?
Which one? I felt like I talked for a while just now.
Sorry. You said you could give a student an answer.
Oh. Yeah. I'm referring to that time, those times, when someone comes to talk, and what they really needed was just to talk, and for me to shut up and listen. But again, I have a didactic impulse. I want to be the Bible answer man. I really do. And as often as I can, I hope those answers are correct. But even a correct answer can be unhelpful to someone who didn't need a correct answer. They need a shoulder to cry on, or a hug, or someone just to sit with them. That's the most shocking thing. My wife and I had, the last 3 years have been difficult for our families. My wife lost her father 2 years ago, and I lost my dad 1.5 years ago. And it's so amazing that all the stuff that you always hear about people who've experienced great loss could not have been more true. It really is the people that show up. The whole ministry of presence, I used to make fun of. Oh, we're doing a ministry of presence, a.k.a. nothing. Until all of a sudden people showed up in my life. They didn't say anything. I don't remember anything that anybody said. They showed up in my life. To some degree, there's a view of God's providence that helped feed that. All right? Let me go on to number 3 here. As he runs, not running out of time. We're doing good. We're doing good. Number 3, we make assumptions about the individual. Again, presuppositions, creating a posture in me. I've got an explicit theological posture. I have a providential posture, relying upon God's sovereignty in that. But I also have an assumption about the nature of individuals. This is a big one. These are assumptions about the uniqueness of students and the uniqueness of your relationship to students. Okay? Assumptions about the individual. When we talk about students as individual, we remember that the body of Christ is full of diversity. But because your jobs are so ambiguous, and if I'm the first one to tell you that, then, you're welcome. It is very difficult to quantify and or measure whether or not you did your job. Have you felt this? For me, this was amazing. It took 12 years of ministry before Ginger ever sort of was explicit with this. We were in mid-April. This is probably 7 or 8 years ago. And she was like, how are you doing? You seem like things are you're a little moody. What's going on? And I was like, I don't know. I just feel like every time I get these graduating seniors up here and I just feel like I haven't done anything with them. She was like, she goes, oh yeah, your April depression. I was like, what do you mean my April depression? What are you talking about? She goes, you do this every year. Because every year you have a group of people that graduate, and every year, this is what I filled in. And every year I look and have to lament the ministry that I did not do. Terrible at celebrating any ministry that I did do. Can't see that. All I can see is my failures with people. And so every April we go through this depression because graduation's first week of May and off they go. And I got to start back over again. So what that means is there's a tendency on the inside to not honor the fact that with different people, I have to act in different ways. It's okay for me to honor the fact that God creates individuals, but that my soul really wants to kind of lump everybody up together. Because it's so ambiguous. I'm dealing with the ambiguity of ministry. I don't know whether or not I really did anything. And so what I long for is the magical ministry tool. The magical ministry tool. That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. That's a Beatles reference, and it's the first one that's happened today. And you can write it down, okay? The magical ministry tool. What do they say? What's that line? What do they say in that song? No, but what's the... Voila. Is it just voila? What do they say? The magic. Roll up. It's roll up? Are you sure about that? Who said that? Roll up in the magical mystery tour. Roll up for the magical mystery tour. I'm not a Beatles fan. I just know that song. I learned something today. Roll up in the magical mystery tour. That's awesome. For those of you who have no idea what we're talking about, just consider a little break, a mental break. Here's what I want. I'd like a magical ministry tool that when I insert student A and I run them through process, magical ministry tool, out comes mature student B. You see? And I want that thing that works every time. It works every time, man. Now, there's some stuff that you can say that works every time. There's a lot of wisdom in youth ministry that you're going to get this week from people who've done it a lot and can say, man, every time this ends up happening, you can take it and put it in the bank. But we got to be careful not to assume that the individuals whom I have in front of me is just like the individuals I was dealing with before. This person's unique. Sin has worked on this person in very different ways. God's Holy Spirit has worked on this person in all kinds of different ways. God has made them wonderfully diverse. We used to draw a diagram that had this little stick person on it. The stick person. And inexplicably, there was a little beret on his head. And so he was affectionately known as Pepe. And you're wondering, like, why did you reproduce that? I don't know. Because it's a stick person. It's easy to draw. But what we did is we would always identify these clouds around this individual that made them who they were? What is it that makes that student who they are? We could say there's a gender thing, right? Male or female, certain things that I can learn about that. I know there's an educational thing. Are you good in school or are you not good in school? Do you like school? Nobody says they like school, do they? Obviously, there's siblings. What's your relationship like to your brother and your sister? I'll be honest, this is more fascinating to me to watch it. I knew what went on between my brother and sister and I, but watching it as an outside observer, as a parent, is a whole different ball game. And I'm amazed at the cold-hearted junk that comes out of my siblings' mouth to each other. And the amazement sort of jerks up quick because it's like, oh, you mean like the kind of stuff you said to your siblings when you were a kid there, Les? Something's going on with that. That makes that person individual. Obviously, mom and dad, there's a relationship there that makes that person who they are. How about this? Then there's just personality stuff. You know? Who cares how it was formed? Was it genetics or was it sort of like sort of environmental? I don't know, but it's there. They can be introverted, they can be extroverted. Oftentimes, you catch people at the time in which they are deciding who they're going to be. You do know this, don't you? That there's a persona that someone takes on in sort of junior high age that they realize is going to help life work for them. Man, I remember, this is... Don't make too much fun after I tell this story. I can remember the day, it was 5th grade, because it was Mr. Chumney. Mr. Chumney was my teacher in 5th grade. That I came home and realized that there were two kinds of people at school. There were the popular people, and there were the not so popular people. And come hell or high water, I was going to be in that first group. I never said it explicitly, but this was exactly what I believed. And I remember having this moment of self-actualization, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I found out who I was, staring in the mirror of the upstairs bathroom that all the kids shared upstairs. And I remember saying to myself, okay, Les, what are your assets here? Number one, probably not the smart guy. I'm not going to be in with the smart people. It's not going to be my brains that get me through this. My grades are average. It's just going to be the deal. Number two, I'm not the looker. I don't have a way with the ladies, as they do, number two. Number three, I went down this list of like, I know this. I did not say this out loud, and I wish that I had. It would have saved me a lot. Les, you're not an athlete either. I'm not the guy on the athletic field who can, sort of blow the competition away like certain of my friends were. But you know what I remember saying to myself? This is unbelievably clear to me. It's strange the things your mind holds on to at age 47. I said, but you know what? I know how to make people laugh. And in that moment, I sold my soul to being wacky, nutty youth group guy. That's what happened. I sold my soul to the devil so that I could get in exchange for that, so that people would like me. So fast forward about 6 or 7 years to my senior yearbook, my annual. Who called them annuals? Are they annuals or yearbooks? Okay, whatever. And you flip over to the signatures. Do we still sign people's yearbooks? Does this still happen? Okay. If you look at the yearbooks, it's unbelievable how consistent the signatures are. Les, can't believe it's already over. You were so funny in anatomy and physiology every day. Thanks, have a great life. Angie. Les. It was Angie's voice in my memory. She was super nice, actually. In other words, it was unbelievably consistent, this commitment that I had made to this particular way of living. You are dealing with people who are in the midst of that, especially if you work with junior high. And by the way, when it's not so shockingly painful, it's hilarious. Because again, if you think the stuff that goes on between my children is some cold-hearted stuff, you cannot imagine the kind of stuff that's told between junior high people. I cannot believe what you girls say to each other. It's jaw-dropping, okay? But every bit of those friendships create that person's individual nature. And you are a student of this person's life. so that when you minister to them, it is in accordance with their needs, not with your projection of what you either want it to be or simply have not thought about it and been dangerously close to hurting people. Why? Because you went to RYM and they said that there's an individual assumption that I walk in and not cookie cutter people. Helps me love people better. Once again, I am not suggesting that you are not able to generalize about people. Of course you can. Come on. You do the same thing in public school, private school. You do the thing about broken home or, non-broken home. Yes, we can generalize to those things. Yes, we're growing in wisdom. But when it comes down to it, when I sit down in front of a one-on-one, especially for the first time, I got a blank slate. God, where have you been at work? By the way, that was one of the big ones at the bottom of the list was, what has God been working at in this person's life? You don't have to recreate the wheel. This is a great combination of these two presuppositions. You can sit down and know that because they are a human being, God's Spirit has been at work in that person's life. Ever thought about that? I don't have to go up there and conjure something out of thin air. Why? Because God has made Himself manifest to that person. Most obviously through the things that have been made, even His eternal Godhead and divine nature. Now, I also know that in a very sophisticated way, He's suppressing the truth in His unrighteousness, and exercising all manner of idolatries. That's another one we could put. He or she is full of idolatries as well. You see that a person is infinitely interesting. They just are. Even the dullest of youth group persons in your group is infinitely interesting because they're an individual. And don't write that person off. You probably have just because you don't like them. Because they don't match you. That's okay. They're still an individual. And when you treat them as such, you honor them and you keep from abusing them with ministry methods that were intended for different kinds of people. Or for you. Okay? Next. We're on a roll here. And we'll have questions at the end because I need to do about 9 more minutes. Pedagogical assumptions. The way in which you'll typically see this one listed in your literature is the presupposition of the learning process. It piggybacks to some degree on back of the individual assumptions, but this is an assumption about the way in which people come to own information and data as their own. Assumptions about the learning process means that we know a little bit about what learning is. We understand what its implications are for saving faith. We have an assumption about what the elements are that take place in the process of it. We're trying to work through the implications and how it's implemented in ministry. And then we're trying to be aware of the fact that there are avenues whereby these things happen. In other words, we are hoping that there's a growing sophistication that you are getting about how people come to own information. And when I say own, different regions, O-W-N. How do you say that? Own, to own. Is there a Yankee way of saying that? Some Yankees say own. On. There's a pedagogical assumption about how people come to say that information is theirs, that they walk away with their faith becoming their own. Isn't that what we want? So that by the time they go to college, it'll become like those awful youth people who are all leaving the church when they go to college. It's another statistical thing that if I see one more, I'm going to take hostages. People come to own this in different ways. And so the old InterVarsity handbook, this is straight out of InterVarsity Student Fellowship handbook from years ago, identified this little acronym that doesn't spell anything, so it's largely unhelpful. TDOEE. The funny thing is TDOEE has become its own word in RYM circles. So for whatever it's worth, you can get it this way. TDOEE, what does this stand for? T, teaching. There is a sense in which people come to learn because they were taught. There is data. There is content, which is important. There is a big, giant bookstore out there in the hallway because it is an assumption that as you grow in your sophistication with RYM, you are feeding yourself with good data, good books you're reading, good commentaries you're considering, good stuff, good teaching that other people have done that really rings true in your own soul. People come to own information when they are taught that information well. T. D. D stands for demonstrate. We know also that people come to learn things by demonstrating them, that I show them. If you tell me something, I'll forget. If you show me how to do something, then I'll remember. Show me. Give me an example. We demonstrate to the lives of people by giving them an access into our lives that they need. I realize that for a lot of people, your relationship with Young Life, some of you have very strong, positive relationships with Young Life in your context. Others of you have somewhat, maybe slightly antagonistic relationships with Young Life. I will say this, that in all hopes to find something positive, one of the things in which I believe Young Life does very well is to teach its people how to provide access into your life to students so they can see where you are. It may be that what that student really needs is to see you in a place where you are not sort of being official, where you are on, because they may not have a realistic view of what real life looks like. If you are married, the panic that you feel to need to kind of clean up before people come over at least needs to be examined. Don't get me wrong. I know nobody wants to go to somebody's house when it's a disaster. We all feel that way. But to another degree, it can become really idolatrous when it becomes something that I just sort of set out there to give them a version of myself that's an utter lie. And it might be that they need to pop in and say, hello, have I come at a bad time? As a matter of fact, you had, the baby's walking around with no diaper on, they've thrown it around the wall, and it's smeared up against the wall, and somebody's over on the other side, throwing up the crayons that they just ate. And then, sitting in the middle is the mom, on a couch, kind of with a clicker, just sort of staring at it, comatose as well. That might be an image that people get of real life that might help. And who knows, it might result in less disillusioned mommies when they have children who don't have this version of mommyhood, especially among preschool-age children, that is it's such a giant lie that causes them to walk away from the faith when they finally have small children. But I digress. But the bottom line is, to demonstrate my life to someone, they've got to have some kind of access there. Are you finding ways to let them in? Now, you introverts just got nervous because you were like, like, I need to recharge my batteries by myself. You did not hear me say, give people 100% access to your life at all times. That's not what I said. I'm saying, though, they've got to see you when you're not on. Sometime, some way. Whether that's work, whether that's a meeting, whether that's errands that you're running, sometime in which you're off to demonstrate what it looks like to live a godly life. To stop and pause and pray about something with that person. How are your students having access seeing you? Number 3, the O stands for observe. In other words, the D is the manner in which they are allowed access into your life. The O in observing is the manner in which you go inject yourself into their life. You cannot get people to own the information you're trying to get them to own if you have not seen them in their own context. To move into where they live and move. It is not an option to work in youth ministry and be completely unaware of the context in which that student lives for 8 hours of their day. Hear me. And for those of you that have a homeschooling instinct, I'm about to freak you out. I do not have the majority of input into my children's life. There, I said it. And it stopped in kindergarten when we actually paid good money to be like, here you go. We're going to pay you to actually help us out and assist us. If you think that I abdicated my parenting responsibilities by that, then we got to have a conversation after this. Because I disagree with you. But There is a time in which I am a fool if I think I know my children's life just by what I get from them at home, because the majority of their time are in that place over there. If you're going to minister to those people, that is the context. Now, some of your schools will allow you greater or lesser access to those schools. That is as the case may be. But there always ought to be an instinct, if I'm trying to get people to learn the information, that I can get in their world in as unobtrusive a way as I can, or at least a subtle way as I can, to where they will allow me that access to observe their life. Number 4. Number 4 stands for evaluate. Evaluate. People come to learn when they are given feedback about the things you're trying to give across to them. But we cannot assume that for everybody, if I just sort of presented it, well, I told them again and again the way of salvation. But did you stop and talk with them and give them a feedback loop of evaluation about the things in their life that you see, you know, are not measuring up to the standards the gospel sets for them? Have I ever told them? Why do I expect them to have some grasp of that? Well, because I taught it. Not everybody comes to learn and own it that way. They need to be evaluated. They need to have some feedback about how they're coming across to people. This is one of my favorite conversations where a student actually comes and be like, I just always assumed I knew how I came across, but then you said it the other day in small group Bible study, and now I'm kind of wondering, what do people think about me? And what was interesting was how often I could say, I think you're the kind of person who's deeply worried about what people think of you. And that's why you schedule a one-on-one with me to come and ask. The irony is, the people that I most wanted to ask that question are not here. Evaluate. And then finally, E, the last E, is encourage. I had a great sort of magical ministry moment, speaking of those moments, 3 years ago in this very seminar. And Mark Lowry, who is one of the great founders of kind of the RYM philosophy of ministry stuff, was in the room. He was at the back. A very unnerving experience to be regurgitating the thing that somebody else came up with and be like, oh, this is what you meant. No. Did anybody ever see is it Annie Hall with Woody Allen, where he's standing in line at the movie theater and someone's going, well, Marshall McLuhan would never say blah, 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 blah. And Woody Allen goes, really? Well, here's Marshall McLuhan right here. And marches him out, and Marshall McLuhan looks at the guy and goes, no, you've completely got me wrong. That's not at all what I said. And Woody Allen looks at the camera and says, don't you wish you could do that? Like when you got somebody who's kind of mouthing off. Nobody has any idea what Annie Hall and Woody Allen is. You're all looking at me with completely blank expressions. Who is Woody Hall? Never mind. Just went right past you. But we don't always have that. But Mark is in the back and he raises his hand and he goes, Les, wait a minute. He goes, you reversed the 2 E's. I said encourage and then evaluate. And he said, no, it's evaluate, then encourage. And of course, I thought, okay, but they both start with E, don't they? And here's what he said. I love this. This is awesome. He said, because you can't evaluate people without giving them encouragement on the other side. You can't, oh, that's pretty good, wasn't it? You can't leave RUF without doing an imitation of Mark Lowry. You can't bring evaluation and critique to people's life without finishing with encouragement, encouragement, encouragement. My youth director in high school, I dated a girl who had an eating disorder. And I remember him saying to me, I'll never forget this, him saying, look, Les, with someone who struggles with that particular struggle, you have 3 things that you need to do. You need to encourage, encourage, and encourage. They are bottomless pits of encouragement. Truth is now, after however many years of ministry, everybody is. You cannot tell them that they did a good job too many times. You just can't. Finish with that. You know what will happen? They'll actually learn from you. Because that's part of the learning process. Teaching, demonstrating, observing, evaluating, and encouraging. This is how people come to own the things that we really want them to own. I have 3 more minutes to do this and we'll have 5 minutes of questions. Lastly, demographical assumptions. Assumptions about demographics. Okay? What do we mean by this? Well, this one's fairly obvious. This is an assumption about the environment of your ministry. Great harm can come especially to you personally if you are not a student of your context. There's a lot of things that make Tim Keller an important person, I would argue. I think one of the things that people don't celebrate in what Keller has been able to do in the metro New York area is how much of a student of the city he is. This doesn't make it out very much, but anything that he can get his hands on and read, he'll take weekends. His son works for us, and so he's the one who told me the story. Me and Tim don't like talk on the phone or something. He's always stealing my illustrations and whatnot. But Michael said there'll be times in which, like, his favorite thing to do, who is an introvert, by the way, for a weekend, is to buy a book on a neighborhood of Manhattan or Brooklyn or Queens or whatever. And he will go to that neighborhood, find a park bench, and read the book about the neighborhood and walk around and see and do the stuff. That's his idea of a kickin' weekend. Look at us all laughing in mockery of Tim Keller. And there's not a person in this room that wouldn't kill to have the man's insight. But let's set that aside. You're so condescending. Do you hear what he does for his spare time? I knew he was weird. But here's the deal. He knows that if I'm going to minister in this place, I've got to know what this city is about. Your campus. I love asking this question. What is your number one feeder school? What's the school that is feeding your youth group the most? Where are they coming from the most? Because you are a student of that topic. You're looking for demographical data. You're pulling that principal aside and being like, just curious, what is the male-female breakdown of this school? Just curious, does anybody ever give you any religious data about where people do in terms of their preference? In other words, when a newspaper comes out, when the school newspaper comes out, which I'm sure is like the highest journalism possible, you want to read something. I want to be about a student of your world. And so I look for demographic data wherever I can find it. And what this does is it affects the things that can be done. You know how to measure your abilities and successes. It'll keep you from great frustration. My favorite illustration is this is from a friend of mine who started the RUF work at Harvard. And I remember him coming back to staff training during his second year and talking about his miserably fail of his Christmas party. He scheduled a Christmas party at the end of the semester every year. Instead of having his Bible study, which was fairly well attended for Harvard, he had a Christmas party that he threw. And for the second year in a row, 0 people came. Goose egg, nada, not one. For the second year in a row. And so he comes to staff training just crestfallen. I don't know what's going on. And it was one of those great things that as he was talking out loud about it, he was like, well, you know, I figured that since it's exam week, we would have like a party instead of our regular Bible study. At which time someone was like, you know, I'm no expert on Harvard, but they might be studying during exam week. In other words, when you're at Harvard, you might ought to let that go. Because that's a cultural thing that you're trying to create. You may put a lot of energy into it. We got a cheese ball with crackers for Pete's sake. And now my wife and I got to eat it for the next week and a half because nobody came. Why? Because I didn't study my context enough to know that I'm at Harvard. What is your demographic data that's the biggest deal? In the years to come, you ought to be able to come back to RYM and tell somebody else what the biggest demographical sort of lights-on moment that you had because you were such a student of your context. Some of you who've never heard of your place, you just got there, this will be slow. Some of you grew up there and you're going to have to fight the tendency to caricature. And you got to make sure that your caricatures are accurate. I'm from Memphis, stayed in Memphis, do youth ministry, and that was a big problem. Because I made assumptions about it that simply were not true. Demographical assumptions. Joey's going to do stuff on the church and stuff on family. That'll all be great and insightful. But I left about 3 minutes for questions for you about any of this material that we've covered. Y'all been very patient. Any summary questions? This is all we there we go. There's one back.
Is there a natural flow of these presuppositions? Do you have to, is there a reason why biblical theological assumption is number one?
Nope. Not that I can think of. The Bible is important, But remember, what did you learn at RYM? The Bible is important. Remember, the presuppositions are not things that are important. I would actually argue that that's what our principles are. Those are things that should be understood and committed to. The presuppositions are definitions of posture creations. This is the mode of ministry that help inform it. So no, there is no logical order to it.
So how do you know what your providential assumption is without knowing your biblical theological assumption?
Again, don't try to make it important. It's not that it's not important. Of course we know the doctrine of God's providence is important. We're simply saying, and here's another thing. Someone will say, why these 7 and not a couple others? And the answer is, no real good reason. Other than the fact that we've decided that this is what we're going to talk about. And that's not a small thing. This is not a completely fluid document. It's not. At the same time, it's also not been sort of like, boom, and you're just kind of like, oh, I could stare at it, it gets more brilliant every time. What happens is these things begin to percolate. You begin to talk about them and be like, what really struck me was that learning process thing. I really get that because I haven't really been engaging myself. And then someone else will say, well, actually, I really thought the provident. See what I'm saying? It's made to sort of give you hooks to think about because it fashions you like it does clay. And it creates impressions here and movement in that direction so that eventually when you begin to see actions and reactions coming out of you when you deal with students, or maybe you even identify problems in your ministry that you want to get better at, it might be that there's one of these presuppositions that hasn't sort of fully formed in you. Am I helping or hurting? Smoke's about to come out of your ears because I love that you're working through it right this moment. That's awesome. Follow up with another question if we don't get to it. Somebody else had their hand up over here. Did I see another hand? I see that hand. Yes. Matthew. Eichard?
Yes.
Eichard.
That's exactly right.
I almost said Icard. That wouldn't have been right.
As I hear you saying these things, I get very excited about this on a philosophical, theological level. Practically, I hear time, commitment of time to understand the demographic, to understand the individual. That's conversation, that's meals, that's getting into the schools, getting into the home, and I love that. But in the ministry that I lead, and the size and the dynamics, and I'll just be very honest with all of you, I feel like I'm drowning to fulfill my job description as it is.
Sure.
So how do you begin to help people understand, I want to keep the main thing here, so we need to revisit what I'm actually doing or what I can actually do and can't do as one individual in a pretty large ministry machine.
Yeah.
I use that word, but
Sure. Yeah.
any wisdom there?
My first impression is, wow, look what you did. You just employed that one and that one about your own job. You said there's only a certain number of hours in the day that I have a capacity to kind of work through. That's a demographical question. I only have certain hours of the day in which I can invest in this. Some of you are part-time youth ministers. You have other jobs. Some of you are full-time youth ministers, but you've got other responsibilities in the church. Those are demographical issues about your context. You're also identifying things about yourself that you may or may not be able to juggle and have balls in the air at one time. That's part of this as well. Again, this is not about overwork. These are not a list of responsibilities of stuff you have to do. These are ways of presenting to you what a minister who is thinking through their ministry looks like, so that I don't act in such a way that contradicts what I believe. Does that help? It's still a question about what these presuppositions are, and we're not saying that it's just stuff that is important. We think they're important, else we wouldn't have spent the last 2 hours on it. We're saying that they are posture, they are conceptual recommendations. Who was it the covenant professor used to use that phrase? The why am I looking over here? Why am I looking at you for covenant professors? Who was the covenant professor? Who was the philosophy professor? McClellan? Anybody go to covenant seminary, covenant college? Yes, McClellan. This was his phrase. I'm offering to you a conceptual recommendation to say, try this on. Wrap your mental framework around some of these emphases and see if it doesn't begin to shape the way in which you think about why you're doing what you're doing. So the mere fact that you look and say, man, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed, there's a bunch of stuff going on, I want to say, guess what? Then we've identified an issue. So I may discover something about myself that may not have the capacity to do all the things. In other words, this was not a list of to-dos. Actually, it was just the opposite. It's getting me to think about my to-do list. Is that helping?
But it does involve, I mean, what he's hearing is, if I'm going to assess an individual, and that's a commitment that I've got, not to do a cookie-cutter ministry, I've got to know my people, then I do have to spend time with my people. And my ministry is so large.
Of course.
How do I begin to do that? And then when you complicate that with the leadership in the church actually has a philosophy of ministry that's diametrically, in many ways, opposed to this,
Yes.
what do I do then? So how can I bring people on the same page
Yep.
so we can attack this thing together?
Yep. And my answer to that would be, that's what the rest of the seminar teachers are going to talk with you about for the rest of the week. But for our purposes, this is simply trying to get us onto the playing field to get ready to minister. How about that? That's not bad. I like that. This is here to get us ready to be good at whatever we do. Your time management and how you go about implementing things is a question about our Pentagon. It's got a question about implementation of goals, the setting of goals, the achieving of goals, how I sort of put these things together. For now, I'm just trying to get you in the right frame of mind. That's all these things are doing. That's why they're more impressions and not a logical order. Let's do one more question, and we'll see if that doesn't wrap us up. Yes?
It's really a statement, but this can give direction to your conversations with parents. Trying to figure out individual assumptions, demographics, this kind of thing.
I'll say that, I like that. This is part of the power of shared lingo, that once it becomes more natural to you, you begin to talk about it in this way. Like God is at work is just, that's lingo in RYM. You'll hear it. I mean, the speakers will talk about it, the seminar people will talk about it. Like it just kind of gets in there. And eventually people begin, that becomes a part of your ministry. And there's an indirect, implicit hope that that's also shaping the minds of the people who are watching you do what you do. I know that you're in difficult situations where there's ministry settings where you're going, my church ain't going to be for any of this. Because all the bad stuff we're not supposed to do that you've been talking about, we do it all. And people got justifications for it as we do. Okay. But at least let's get my head straight. Let's start with that. And it may well be that as I interact with people, they will be won over by nothing more than the confidence that I'm gaining from at least knowing why I'm doing what I'm doing. To be honest with you, the presuppositions are intended to create confidence in you. Not cockiness, but confidence. That I don't have to walk around panicked or crestfallen or depressed because the semester didn't go the way in which I wanted it to go. It didn't. But you know what? God's at work. One of the things that sort of I'll finish with this. One of the things that after some very dramatic conversations I had very early on in my ministry with people who loved me and confronted me well was suddenly getting to where I hated myself in ministry. You know what I'm talking about? I left University of Memphis to go to Ole Miss, which is a very successful ministry with a lot of people who've done it extraordinarily well. And I was, by constitution, very different from the previous campus minister. And there's no way in which I can count how many days I went back to my little office, closed and would lock the door, and would just weep. You know, and that's where you get on your hands and knees where you can put your face in the chair and just weep. Because I wasn't like my predecessor. And I couldn't make myself do it. And it was some wisdom from a friend, actually at a staff training event, that said, look, God is not coming to replace your personality, Les. God is coming to redeem your personality. And what that means is that you can trust that He's been at work. And that there are certain things that He's going to use in you, that you're going to do well. And He's going to be happy to be a part of. You're not going to stop repenting. We're not going to remove ourselves from a posture of openness that God may have something to say to me that might hurt. Of course I'm always in that posture. But tell me again how God is at work. Because otherwise I'm going to sit in front of my students and they're going to be, he's a great youth director. He's depressed a lot, but nice guy. Okay. Y'all are great. Fascinating sort of questions. Appreciate y'all's help with it. Know that we are praying for you. We'll let you go on a break after I close in prayer. Is there any other announcements, Joey, about what we got after this? Okay, let me pray for you. Lord Jesus, you said that if we, being evil, know how to ask, get good gifts to our children, how much more will you give the Holy Spirit to those who ask? And so on behalf of my friends here,